So, validation and verification. What are all these big words that begin with V all about? Well, when we're collecting data, we might typically do it on paper with a data capture form. Somebody will fill out their details. But if we enter their details wrong into our database, typically using a database form, then when we come to run a query or a report from our database, those errors will show up. So quite clearly, Julie Mowbray should not be gender M. And this is known as GIGO, which stands for garbage in, garbage out. Your reports, your data, your information from your system is only as good as the data that's initially entered into it. Garbage in, garbage out. Validation is where we have rules and checks on our database in different fields. It can only make sure that data entered is sensible. It can't make sure that data entered is correct. This is a common misconception that students make when answering this question. They try and put that validation will help make sure that data is correct. It can't do that. A couple of examples. Computer doesn't know that Julie is female, not male. Computer doesn't know that the date 13th of the 12th, 2001 should have been used and not 14th of the 12th, 2001. Computer can't check that those things are right, but it can check to make sure that things are sensible. So when you think of validation, think sensible and not correct. Definition to remember for an exam might be that validation aims to make sure that data is sensible, reasonable, complete, and within acceptable boundaries. It can help to minimize errors, but can't always stop them. Some examples of validation. Presence validation is used a lot. So if we're in a database here and we go to the design of the table and we went onto the surname field, for instance, I can see that the settings have been made on this field so that it is required and that it can't be of 0 length, which means that if we go and try and enter somebody without a surname, eventually we get an error message saying you can't do that, and we've got to put the surname back in to be able to move on to somebody else. So that's an example of validation. We don't want anybody to be entered into the database without a surname, and the database has that rule in it, has that check within it. Another example of validation is range validation. So if I again go back to the design of this table and go to the date of birth field, there is a validation rule set on here that's saying that dates must be between 1st of the 1st 1990 and 1st of the 1st 2017. So if I try and put in a date of birth for somebody that was 1989, I get my error message coming up, please enter a valid DOB. So again, a validation check is on there, and that's called range validation because dates have to be within a certain range. Lookup validation is where a field such as gender, we can set different options to create a drop-down list. So only options from the drop-down list can be chosen. Therefore, we have validation on that field. And you set those up again in the properties. And we're limiting to list, which means there have to be values that are chosen from the list. Data type validation is probably the most simple form of validation, which means that if data is of a certain type, such as this field, how much would you like to spend on sport per week, is set to currency, we cannot go and enter some just raw text into that field. It's giving us an error message saying the value you entered does not match the currency data type in this column. So that's the most simple form of validation and happens automatically when you set a data type for a field. So we could only enter dates and times into that field, for instance. There are other types of validation such as check digit, which will make sure that a particular digit is in a particular place in some data that you entered. Length check to make sure that data entered is of a certain minimum, maximum length. Format check to make sure things like postcodes are in a particular format. There are types of error that can be made when people are entering data into a database. The first type is transcription. And that is where there will be an error reading something or listening to somebody. So if somebody told me that their name was Smith, and I entered it spelt with the Y there, when really they wanted it entered in the usual form, then that will be a transcription error. A transposition error is your typical typo, where somebody types something wrong. And often it's the order of things that are going wrong. Somebody might put in 76 instead of 67, or Simth instead of Smith. Verification is different from validation. It's not rules that are put onto database fields to try and make sure things are sensible. It is the checking of entered data against the original source document. It says the original source document, check what's on there, check that it matches what's in the database. A form of verification that you might be familiar with is when you're asked to change your password, that you've got to put in a new password twice. That's called double entry, just to make sure what you're putting in there is correct, because you've put it in twice.